Michael Eliason. He is the founder of Larch Lab, which is a part design and urbanism firm and a part think and do tank, their words. Michael is really considered to be one of the leaders in building climate adaptive, socially connected homes. He has built, done research and policy, worked on decarbonized, climate adaptive, low energy buildings and sustainable urbanism. He's also a writer, an award-winning architect who's specializing in mass timber, social housing, co-housing, and eco-districts. So he has experience working all over the Northwest, experience working in Germany, and he has some, very specific examples that he will share with us. And we're really excited to invite him here virtually. Michael is here with us. Thank you for coming, Michael. And I'm going to leave the mic to him, and then we're going to come back for the Q&A. Michael.
All right. Well, thank you for having me. I guess it's lunchtime for some people. I would love to have some food teleported. So I'm going to talk a little bit about building codes and zoning codes and how they can impede community-oriented development. Servus, the Irish greeting for hello. Founder of Larch Lab, specialized in mass timber, passive house, Ecodistricts, Baugruppen, which are a form of self-developed urban co-housing that we've been trying to do for a long time. I'm also a car-free dad. We don't own a car. We have 2 kids. We get around by cargo bike. So living a low-carbon life is really foundational to kind of how we are. So building access isn't really something that a lot of people think about, but I think it plays a big part in how community can be either influenced or built or impeded. We could also title this Why I Loathe Corridors. So there are effectively 3 types of vertical access in multifamily buildings. There's the double loaded corridor. This is kind of your typical project in North America, hallway down the middle and units on either side. There's the single loaded corridor. This is more common in Canada than it is in the US, but it's not as common. You have a corridor on the exterior. It can be open to the elements or enclosed, and then units parceled off of that. The Vancouver house is kind of a modified single loaded corridor. And not common in the US or Canada at all is the point access block, but this is the foundational building block for urbanism kind of the world over. And so just a little bit more background on each of these, right? So the double loaded corridor, you have your circulation here, it's the yellow, and units parceled off on either side. Primarily, you're gonna have small units. It's the orientation of the building. It's a thicker building. It's difficult to get larger units in. Larger units tend to have to economically compete against smaller units. So if you're doing a 3-bedroom unit, that could take the place of 2 or 3 studios. And so it's really difficult to find that kind of affordable aspect on double loaded corridor buildings. There's also no cross ventilation. So if you're living here and it's hot and this is the south side, you can't really have air come in through your building to cool it off like you could in the Vienna house project. It also means there's no daylight on multiple sides. So daylight autonomy, especially with work from home and other things, becomes problematic. And in the US, and I think in Canada as well, we tend to put most of our dense housing on arterials. They're loud, there's pollution. And so it means that people who live on the arterial don't really have any respite from those elements. Just a quick example of the double loaded corridor. Again, this is in Portland, but you would see this almost anywhere in North America. Corridor down the middle, not a very good mix of units. And then the corners are kind of where you can get 2 bedrooms or 3 bedrooms, but it's not a lot. The single loaded corridor is not quite as efficient plate-wise as the double loaded corridor. You can get a little bit more diversity in unit sizes, but I think what's more important is that you get cross ventilation, as we saw in the Vienna house. You can have more daylight autonomy, you get light on both sides. And so this, I think this is a really good typology, but it's not used in a lot of instances because the development can't be maximized. And that's a whole other conversation we could have about FAR and its effect on livability. This is a single loaded corridor building in Vienna, social housing. There's train tracks here. They're actually using the corridor as a means of buffering noise from the units which are here facing south and the rail car. And lastly is the point access block. This is a single stair building. Like I said, it's kind of the foundational urban building block the world over. Extremely efficient. In a lot of countries, you can have the doors open directly to the stairway. You have limitations on the distance or area that each stair can access, and so there's also limits on numbers. But you get daylight on multiple sides. You get cross ventilation for most units. You have a small number of people that you know. which again, in building community and everything else, I think is important. And then you can put all your bedrooms potentially on one side, right? So it's quieter for people who live on busy streets. And so why is this legal in some places and some it's not? It's an interesting conversation. It has to do with firefighter liability and approach. In Europe and most of the world, the fire department goes in and rescues people. In the US and Canada, it's a little bit different. They focus on rescuing people, but it's also on putting out the fire. And so the approaches are slightly different. In the US, we can generally build 3 stories with our building code for a single stair building. Again, limitations on the number of units per floor, accessing each stairway and the distance to it. In Seattle, we can write our own building code a little bit, kind of like Vancouver. And so we've extended that up to 5 or 6 if you have work lofts or commercial or parking on the ground floor. New York City also does 6. And Canada is even more restrictive in this nature. You can only do 2 floors of a single stair building. Although that is changing. So Konrad Speckert is a Swiss grad from McGill whose thesis was on single stair buildings. And just this April, he and a team submitted a code modification to allow single story buildings up to 6 floors in Canada. Just to give you a sense of kind of where this is globally. So Canada here, the US is generally here, 3 to 4 stories. In Seattle and New York are here, 5, 6 stories max. But throughout the world, 8, 10, 12 stories, relatively common for single stair buildings. Of course, in the UK, in Italy, you can go much higher, South Korea as well. It's a very different approach. Grenfell, there were issues with that. I feel like that's really too tall. I've stayed in 8 and 10 story point access block buildings. And I think anything above 8 stories for me personally was a little bit weird. So again, the benefits of the point access block, well, you have a super compact building. You can have light on multiple sides. You get cross ventilation. Your floor plate is incredibly efficient. And so what this means is that you don't have to have as much of your floor area going to circulation. You could have larger units, or you could have more and better amenity spaces. You get a diversity of units. So family sized units are fairly common in point access blocks, whereas you don't see them on the double loaded corridor. And so, it's really a way of knowing people better, I think. You have 3 to 4 households sharing one stairway on one floor. You really get to know those people more than you would if you were sharing a corridor with 40 or even 60 units. And when you think about the building, right, there's 6, 8 floors per building or something. Again, you're not having to know multiple people in your building. You're not having to deal with other random people walking through your building. So again, it's another way, I think, of thinking about community building, facilitating that. This is 2 floor plans. This is Mies van der Rohe. This is a tower he did in Detroit. This is a co-housing project in Berlin. Highlight the circulation spaces, and I think this kind of shows the 2 different approaches. In the US and Canada, we do the double loaded corridor down the middle. There's not a wide mix of units. It's mostly 1 bedrooms, a couple of 2 at the corner. There's no cross ventilation. If you live on the noisy side of the street, you're always going to be on the noisy side of the street. But the rest of the world doesn't really plan buildings that way. If you have a longer building, if you have a longer site, they'll break it up into multiple buildings. There'll be smaller buildings. We'll zoom in a little bit closer. So here's the circulation space, the yellow, but there's a diversity of unit sizes. You've got a 1 bedroom here. You've got a 4 bedroom here. Most of the bedrooms are put on one side of the building. And so if this is the street, well, then, the noisy part of the house when you're up, around for the daytime is on that street. And when you go to bed, you're on the quiet side, the courtyard. It's a much more, I think, humane way of living. Cross ventilation, daylight autonomy, all of those things are kind of inherent in this way as working. In Seattle, we can do 2 of these buildings conjoined on the same lot. We can't go more than 2. But in Europe, there are buildings that are hundreds of meters long that have 10, 20, 30 of these kind of all gang together. And so there's this aspect running through all of my work, right? It's how do our codes affect quality of life, right? Do we have like the scary corridor of the double loaded corridor, or do we have this bright, airy, open communicative stairway? This is a Baugruppen, a co-housing project in Austria. All of the units directly access the stairway. There's a skylight above. It's also part of the extracting heat and smoke if there's a fire. Kids can play here. You kind of know everybody in your building, right? You're always going to see people if they're in the hallways at the same time as you. You can say hello, right? It's a very different way of living. And just a quick, so I was hired by the city of Vancouver to do a kind of a study on using point access blocks as a means of unlocking more affordable housing in the kind of missing middle mid-rise section. This is a really elegant project in Paris and kind of Haussmann Paris by Frez Architectus, 9 units, but it only has a single stair. If this was required to have a single stair, they wouldn't have the diversity of units that they have. And it's a really small site, so they wouldn't have had as many units at all. Most of the units have cross ventilation, daylight on both sides, overlooking a courtyard, right? So there's the quiet side of the building and the noisy side of the building. And in the middle of that report, and I think this ties in really well with the presentations from yesterday and today, I was asked to look at the Vienna house, which was presented by John earlier, under the guise of what would this look like if it were a point access block and point access blocks were legal in Canada. So I kind of took their typical floor plan, keep all of the unit mix sizes about the same, and then just kind of reconfigure it from this single loaded corridor that wraps around the courtyard into what this would look like in Germany. Well, we would have 5 houses, 5 different buildings, each one accessing 4 units, much more compact space, accessing each of the units. So you really know all of these people in your building. You lose, I think, the effect of the courtyard, which the fluid demonstration yesterday was really Bruce Hayden's presentation good at doing. I kind of view this as a kind of moderation between the 2 extremes, though. You have a much more compact building, which is great from the passive house side. It also reduces costs significantly. It also opens up more of the interior space here for common courtyards. There are a couple of negatives to this. So some of the units do have cross ventilation, but about half of them, if with this configuration, would not. And so that you lose some of the, I think, livability components, but there are some trade-offs. And in doing this, looking at the kind of the thermal envelope overlay to get a sense of how effective from a passive house standpoint it is, the German-inspired approach is about 15% less heated area per floor over the Vienna house design. And so the compactness is really kind of key and crucial to this, to resource efficiency, to meeting passive house, to keeping our embodied carbon low, right? It's everywhere here is kind of where we need to be in urban areas to kind of optimizing all of those issues. But there are huge zoning code conflicts, and there are building code conflicts. So the building code really requires these buildings to be big and bulky with massive amounts of lot assemblage. We can't do that small lot development like you see in so many other countries. But then our zoning regimes will come in and have these regulations like modulation or other things to break up the building. So it's not just one big block. I like to refer to this as kind of faking old urbanism. We're taking new buildings and trying to make them look like older historic patterns of development, and it just doesn't work, right? Like everyone looks at this and they'll have the exact same complaints. Like there's 20 different materials. It's still bulky. There's no finesse to it. Is there a better way? And in Seattle, we have an affordable housing overlay. None of the effects of the embodied carbon, the maintenance, the durability, energy efficiency, none of this was really taken into account. It was just, look, we're going to add some height. We'll kind of shrink the footprint of that upper floor to allow the affordable housing, and it'll be fine. But it's been really difficult. There's not a lot of on-site affordable housing being produced with this. Toronto has their own mid-rise regulations. I look at this, not just from a building standpoint, passive house, energy efficiency, decarbonization, my head just explodes, right? Like this is not how we plan cities to be affordable, efficient, even livable, right? Like it's deferring to the low-rise zones, but this floor plate here is incredibly thick. I've seen floor plans for studios that are like 12 feet long and 12 feet wide and 40 feet long in some of the buildings in Toronto. Light and ventilation only on one side because it's a double-loaded corridor. Like it's not really a very livable space. So, if you're stuck there for a long period of time with work from home, many of us have been. And so the climate crisis is really kind of foundational to how I've been thinking about, approaching building design. The wildfire smoke season is now an issue, the heat dome, flooding, all of these things are there. But if we were building to be, incorporating passive house standards, right? We're mitigating a lot of those issues. Our building can be a fresh air center. The wildfire smoke isn't going to be coming in to the degree that it would with other buildings. They can be used as cooling centers. And the IPCC's recently released Working Group 3 report also highlighted co-housing as a means of climate change mitigation. And it took me a second, I'm a huge fan of co-housing and Baugruppen, but it took me a second even then to realize what it was about. Shared spaces, better amenities. So it's about compact living, resource efficient living in urban areas. And then it also highlighted that it limits isolation. I mean, these are all connected, right? Like all of these things dovetail so perfectly. And so what is a Baugruppe? What is this thing that I've been focusing on? It's effectively self-developed urban co-housing. It's really common in Germany. Austria has their own version now. The Netherlands has their own version called the CPO. People come together and effectively self-develop their own multifamily housing. It tends to be a little bit more middle class than affordable, although there are some Baugruppen that will have refugee housing or affordable housing. In Austria, a lot of the social housing in Vienna is moving towards the Baugruppe form as well. Legal form varies, an LLC, cooperative, that's fine. But it's really development without developers, right? Like you take out your developer profit, you take out your marketing costs, and you save in Seattle somewhere between 10 and 20%. You still have project managers and they're still designed. The whole design process is the same. And really what you're left with, the question mark is the land, right? And so some jurisdictions actually are really proactive in having land disposition regulations to facilitate this kind of living, right? They realize keeping middle class households and families in the city is good for the health of the city long term. It allows for multi-generational living, solving that social isolation issue. And so they reserve land in all of their development for these kinds of housing. So Tübingen is a big one. Freiburg, Hamburg, Amsterdam, Vienna, all of these places are saying, look, we got this brownfield development. We're going to reserve X amount of land for this form of housing, right? 10%, 20%. The whole competitions and say, okay, look, come to us with your idea. The best idea is going to get this parcel. We'll either give it to you at cost or at a reduced rate. It's not going to be sold at market. And so out of this process comes like this crazy thing where it's like, what's the most sustainable building we can do? Can we be LGBTQIA friendly housing, multi-generational, car-free, family-friendly Baugruppe with refugee housing, right? So it kind of activates this wild creation of community. The amenities, again, as we're talked about earlier, play a huge part of this as well. The Baugruppen in Vienna have the most wonderful amenities you've ever seen: workshops, music rooms, multifunctional rooms that can be utilized by the wider community, not just those residents. They integrate saunas and libraries and then rooftop gardens, big bike rooms, right? It's really about kind of facilitating low carbon living. And then how do you scale that up? The city of Stuttgart has this new quartier that'll be developed soon. The entire ground floor of this property is going to be socially activated spaces. There'll be daycares, there'll be co-working spaces, workshops. There's a mobility hub, so all of the cars and the transit is moved outside of this core, right? And you have this open, free-flowing green space, parks, playgrounds. It's really about activating that ground floor, right? And then putting in everything that you need for living the 15-minute city, living that kind of low carbon life. Another aspect that I don't think we really take into account, but it was great to see the Vienna House project take into account, is mitigating noise. Noise pollution is huge. Dementia, heart disease, there's a whole host of issues. Again, in the US, we focus all of our affordable housing on arterials. Well, what that means is that the people most at risk for health risks are then put on those streets that have the highest risk of exacerbating those health issues. And in much of Europe, that's not the case. They'll have housing on arterials, but they'll continue that density for blocks and blocks. And so there's an opportunity to use the building as a form of mitigating some of that noise. So this is a project that's actually wrapping up in Munich by Alles wird gut. There's a highway here on the south side. The building blocks all of that noise. And then you have this wondrous, family-friendly, community-oriented development to the interior with no cars, right? Kids can go outside and play and not have to be inundated by traffic noise. Or you can send your kids across the street to the building where their friends live and not have to worry about them crossing the street safely. So it's really a different way, I think, of living. And you can even take that concept to, how do we retrofit those 1970s buildings that are single loaded corridor? Can we create that corridor that's to the exterior as a space that can be utilized for community? Can we add balconies that have, gardens, winter gardens, spaces for communities to come together? Are we adding like mixing zones? This is this wonderful cooperative in the new district in Vienna called Seestadt, massive cooperative, prefabrication, low energy, passive house. And then they have this huge kind of arena in the middle where everybody can come together. The neighborhood can come and put on performances here. Kids can play here. There's kind of like all of these wonderful little places tucked around for kids to hide into. Like, it's just this fascinating way of living for me. And then again, like larger scale. We need to be developing neighborhoods that are in line with a lot of these ideals. We recently opened a light rail station here in Seattle. There's no open space. There's little social housing. There are no car-free streets or no slow streets for kids to play safely on. Right? This ecosystem for incorporating these ideas, it doesn't really exist here in the U.S. And part of the reason why I founded Larch Lab was I wanted to kickstart more of these conversations. But in Europe, they have these wonderful districts that are green, they're lush. There's this mix of housing, Baugruppen, cooperatives, social housing, market rate housing, right? So you have this good economic and social mix of residents. You know, they integrate schools, daycare, it's kind of everything that you need to live within this really compact environment. And then you take most of the cars out of the equation as well, right? It becomes this really livable and climate adaptive place. And I think that the next scale above that, and Vienna is pioneering a lot of this, so it's great to see all the conversation between Vancouver and Vienna happening, is thinking about these eco-districts as kind of a carbon sink. So this is Sonnenviertel in Vienna. It's almost completely built out now. Huge development, massive amounts of green space, open space. There's a huge school campus. There's social housing. There's Baugruppen. There's space for jobs. There's grocery stores. There's cafes. It's adjacent to tram. It's not even like light rail adjacent, but all of these buildings are 6 to 10 stories tall. It's like this really wonderful scale of living. Almost everything is passive house or nearby. It's very family friendly, affordable housing, affordable artist spaces, right? It's like, to me, this is like the direction that I think cities need to go to really facilitate this low carbon living, to solve the isolation crisis, to mitigate the climate issue. You know, and so it's really about looking at these as spaces where we can kind of address all of these issues simultaneously. We're not getting there, but my hope is that, you know, in the US, we start to have more conversations around this. It's great to see this is the 4th presentation I've done with Canadian organizations in the last 6 months. Like, these conversations are happening, and it's just really wonderful to see. So that's all I have. Kept it kind of abbreviated and sped up, but hopefully that was, are we good?
Yeah, Michael, thank you so much. I'm just realizing that it is very bright behind me, and I'm just gonna do this.
Okay.
Yeah, there we go. That's better. Thanks so much, Michael. This was a really wonderful presentation. Apologies once again for the technical difficulties. But I'm really happy that our folks online could see your presentation, because it touches on so many important points. And as someone myself who is involved in, you know, designing communities and helping make these spaces build, the challenges that you're pointing out here, the requirements for stairwells, the kind of the zoning regulations that push buildings to be a certain shape, it's challenges that city builders face, and I think people don't understand. So I have a bunch of questions, but I also want to invite the people in the audience here. I don't think we're using Slido for this, so just type your questions in the chat. They tell me we can use Slido, so you can choose whichever you want. You can type it in the chat. You can type it on Slido, and we will we'll have some questions for you, and then I'll probably jump in with a question of my own. I'll take the first question here from Rob. What's your advice for how to change the trends in design and zoning in Canada?
Oh man, that's a good question. So I've been having conversations around land use and zoning in Seattle for over a decade at this point, and really a lot hasn't changed. I think that the push really has to be from the top. I think there needs to be a little bit of top down, bottom up, which, by the way, is also how Vienna does all of their planning. where the national level, someone comes in and says, look, we're going to have like a minimum zoning level or a minimum density around, I think especially around transit, right? So that we can facilitate low carbon living. Maybe it's, we need 10,000 homes per square kilometer per acre, there's some number. And I think that maybe it's up to the municipality to say, look, okay, we can meet that and this is how we meet it. And maybe there's a little bit of back and forth, but I think that so much of how we do things are like these blanket statements, like only single family houses here, only density here. And, in Seattle, the homelessness issue is out of hand, right? Inequality is out of hand. All of these issues like tie back into the same thing. 100 years ago, there was no zoning in Seattle. You could build multifamily housing on every single parcel. And now you can only build multifamily housing on like 10% of the buildable land in the city, right? So it's really, we need to find ways to open up those conversations, but I'm not an expert in that at all.
Yeah, 10%, you can only build multifamily on 10%, and then no wonder that 10% of land that's so rare that you can build multifamily on is so expensive.
Exactly.
And then you have residents who are saying, well, you're not building affordable housing on these units, so how can they? It's really it's quite a challenge. A lot of these things speak very very strongly to my heart, because I'm just in the process of a rezoning application now for a community. It's more of a community site that's being rezoned from into townhouses, and a 4-story apartment building, some commercial. And the zoning bylaw, well, not actually the bylaw, the municipal planning strategy, which goes a little bit over the zoning bylaw, says that it was made in 1993, says that the community shall have an objective of 70% single family in the entire area. And now I'm expected to respond to that on a site that's near 4 schools, that's on a transit corridor. And just before you, we heard Kent and Hugh talk to us about what they had to go through to build a 6-story building on a transit corridor next to a high school. For me, and it just really brings it highlights kind of the ridiculousness of what we're in right now, doesn't it? And I'm really intrigued in how we can all kind of elevate this conversation to talking about, okay, well, these are very common systemic barriers across North America. How can we all focus together our efforts in addressing them? And you said something really interesting, which is like, well, maybe that needs to come combination of bottom up and top down to say like, okay, well, this community that has SkyTrain needs to have a certain amount of units, and that's not a matter of choice for the community, because it's a regional interest. Or to say that within, I kind of like what Minneapolis did, is say, within 10-minute walk of a transit line, you can build multifamilies in most of these places, or at least build up to 4plexes. I'm going to take one more question here. Mike, can you comment on the relative cost of materials for passive design versus non-passive design, and how much it is kind of usually, and how much of an additional cost it is to build to code as to build a passive house?
So that's a good question. It's hard to get a good answer for this. In the US, they're building affordable housing that meets passive house at costs up to 6-8%. What really drives a lot of the costs are not paying attention to passive house at all. So maybe you take a building all the way through the design phase, and then you try to shoehorn it into being a passive house at the end. Well, if you go that approach, it's going to be the most expensive building that you can do, and that's going to be really high. If you go in from the outset and say, look, this building is going to be a passive house, you have the team aligned for it, you can kind of figure out how to optimize that form, and you're not having to do a ton of insulation. It's maybe just a little bit more than code because it's multifamily, right? So that starts to play into it as well. We don't have, again, this kind of goes back to energy codes. We don't have an energy code in the US, and I think the rest of Canada outside of Vancouver or British Columbia isn't quite as strict as well, right? Weak energy codes prevent or stifle kind of that innovation for like windows and doors that are energy efficient. So we don't have a lot of options in North America for passive house windows, but Europe and China now have a ton of options for passive house windows because they both said, look, our minimum baseline for a building now is effectively a passive house. And so everyone's had to get up to speed. And so part of it is getting our industry as a whole, prefabrication, productivity, all of these issues are also related too. But I think part of it is getting the energy codes to be more efficient so that there's no delta at that point, right? It's like, look, this is just the way we do things. So
yeah, that's really interesting. I'm gonna take another question. I think there's two people who commented on this note. I've been in European buildings. I've been in some of the point access blocks that you mentioned, and the kind of tight 4 to 6 story buildings that I've seen in Amsterdam and in Berlin. Not many of these buildings are accessible. They're sometimes have very steep stairs and quite tight spaces. And we know that that's a challenge. So how can that be mitigated in kind of some of the approaches they're saying? How can we get the compactness right, get the efficiency right, but also get the accessibility right?
Yeah, so I would say historically that's been true. Older buildings were built long before the elevator, and codes varied significantly even between the same city over time periods. Codes in Europe have been a lot more synthesized now with the EU. Basically, any building in Germany over 3 stories requires an elevator. So every one of those point access blocks has its own elevator. Now we could have a fun discussion about why do elevators in the US cost like 4 times more than they do in Germany. And maybe it's because they're manufactured in Germany. Products in Germany are cheaper in general. But I think the key point is all of those units are at least accessible by an elevator. A lot of development, especially in social housing and Baugruppen, the bathrooms or the units themselves are not necessarily accessible, but they're made to be adaptable. And I think that's crucial, right? Like things happen to people all the time randomly. You're riding your bike and you fall off and you can't walk for too much, right? How can your own environment change to adapt to that? And so a lot of those buildings do have fully accessible units, and a lot of the units that are just kind of common units are not the accessible ones are at least adaptable to a certain degree. And I would say it's probably more so than in the US. Like, if we have a double loaded corridor building with 50 units on one floor and they're almost all studios, well, almost none of them are accessible. And because they're so small, they're not adaptable either, right? So I think there are trade-offs to how we do things as well. I noticed that part of the question too was also about kind of the spaces. I'm guessing this is like the urban spaces. And, again, I think historically in the downtown cores, accessibility is a huge issue. Buildings, bathrooms are located in the basements in those areas because they were built before plumbing. But in a lot of the brownfield redevelopments, they're meant to be, it's if not fully accessible, at least somewhat accessible, right? And so flat surfaces, there's no cars, so it's a lot easier. You don't have to have curbs and things of that nature. So, like Sonnenwendviertel and Seestadt in Vienna were much more accessible than even, I would say modern development in the US here in Seattle.
I think that's really interesting. I think it begs a really important point is that, well, perhaps in the past, accessibility was not an important value or wasn't a priority in the development of these buildings. Sometimes, before elevators, that was a challenge. And then it became, and so the standards changed. And some of the examples that you shared make me think of like, well, okay, well, what's our actual value here? Why are we doing setbacks? What is the purpose? What is it responding to? Because if it's sustainability, well, you were telling us, and we know from other projects that like, you have a 6-story building, you make the 6-story setback. That's an extra thermal bridge there, extra surface for heat loss, and what do you really gain to do that? It's mostly to satisfy the neighbors in single-family homes, and is that what we are prioritizing over sustainability, over more housing, because that's floor space area that could be used for more housing? Another kind of question comes into what we were saying about process. Again, sometimes the process can yield buildings that are more adaptive to the communities, but at what cost? Where are our values? I don't think that conversation is really being had, is really happening in the way that we're building things. With that, I'm gonna really say thank you, Michael, and apologize once more. Technical difficulties. Thanks for staying with us. Thanks for giving an excellent presentation. This presentation is recorded, so it's going to be sent to all the folks who were here in person that missed it, and the folks that signed up that couldn't join or couldn't stay today this long. So thanks so much. We really appreciate your time, folks on the Zoom here. Really, thanks you for staying. Thank you for your questions, and it's been a wonderful two-day event. I think we got a little bit arrogant yesterday. We had no issues, and we were like, "Hey, hybrid is easy." But you know, that stuff happens. So thanks all, and we look forward to connecting with you all again. Take care. Enjoy your day.
Thank you.
Bye, Michael.